Picture this. It's 2:00 a.m. You're lying awake in bed, just staring blankly at the ceiling.
We've all been there.
Right. The house is completely quiet, but your brain is incredibly loud, just racing at 100 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Maybe you're thinking about, like, an article you just read regarding melting ice caps, or you're replaying that latest extreme weather alert that buzzed on your phone.
Doom scrolling effect.
Exactly. Your heart rate is elevated, and you feel this heavy, almost, unnameable dread about the future of the planet just sitting right there in your chest.
It's a very specific kind of weight.
It really is. And if you're listening to this and you have ever been in that exact scenario, I want to tell you something right now. You are not crazy. You are not broken.
Not at all.
If you felt this, you're actually part of a massive, quiet psychological shift that's happening globally right this very second.
Yeah, for a really long time, people suffering from these late-night spirals, they thought they were just experiencing personal, isolated stress.
Like it was a them problem.
Right. They internalized it because they didn't have a framework to understand that their biological response was actually linked to a planetary shift.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today for this deep dive is to build exactly that framework.
I love that.
We're diving into a really comprehensive global report on what's broadly called climate anxiety or, eco-anxiety.
Which is such a fascinating field right now.
It is. We're looking at the hard science behind this distress. And we've got a stack of incredibly rich sources for this deep dive.
Yeah, the data is wild.
We've got a massive study covering 32 countries, surveys of thousands of young people, clinical insights from the American Psychological Association, and some cutting-edge psychiatric studies from 2024 and 2025.
So it's all very recent, very relevant data.
Extremely. We're going to map out the psychology of this dread, but more importantly, we're going to extract the evidence-based strategies you can use to, protect your nervous system and actually take meaningful action.
Which is the ultimate goal, right?
Exactly. But I guess before we can figure out how to manage this feeling, we have to precisely define what it is, and maybe just as importantly, what it isn't.
Yeah, so the term eco-anxiety was originally coined by a philosopher named Glenn Albrecht.
Okay.
He used it to describe the incessant, intrusive rumination and individual experiences when fearing environmental doom.
Intrusive rumination, that's a heavy phrase.
It is. And the American Psychological Association later formalized it basically as a chronic fear of environmental doom. But the single most important takeaway from the clinical literature, and this is a huge paradigm shift for how we view mental health, is that climate anxiety is not a mental illness.
Wait, really? Because the word anxiety carries so much clinical baggage.
It does, yeah.
Usually if someone gets diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, the implication is that their brain is, malfunctioning somehow.
And that distinction is the absolute crux of the issue. Clinical anxiety disorders often involve irrational fears.
Right, like being terrified of something harmless.
Exactly. Your brain perceives a threat that isn't actually there, or it vastly overestimates a minor threat, which triggers a fight-or-flight response inappropriately.
Okay, I'm with you.
But climate anxiety is rooted in a scientifically verified, profoundly real existential threat. It's a rational, adaptive response.
Wow, okay.
Physical unease, the depressive thoughts, the obsessive concerns about the ecology, those are perfectly logical, biological reactions to the empirical data we're receiving about the state of our habitat.
So if clinical anxiety is like a malfunctioning smoke detector that keeps going off when there's absolutely no fire,
Right.
then climate anxiety is the detector working perfectly because the house is actually filling with smoke.
That's a perfect way to put it. You wouldn't pull the battery out of a functioning smoke detector just because the alarm is loud.
Or probably try to put out the fire.
Exactly. The anxiety is the alarm alerting you to act. Now, to understand the nuance of that alarm, the clinical literature distinguishes eco-anxiety from a couple of other related concepts. Like, you'll often hear the term solastalgia.
Solastalgia. I'm not sure I've heard that one. How does that differ from the anxiety we're talking about?
So solastalgia is the feeling of homesickness when you're still at home, but your environment has been profoundly degraded.
Oh, wow.
Imagine living in a coastal town your entire life.
Right.
And rising sea levels or repeated hurricanes completely erode the shoreline and destroy the local ecosystem.
So the physical place is there, but the essence is gone.
Yeah, you're still standing in your backyard, but the home you knew is gone. That specific distress is solastalgia.
That's incredibly sad.
It really is. And then there's ecological grief, which is the active mourning of actual or anticipated ecological losses.
Like mourning a species that just went extinct.
Or a coral reef that has bleached and died.
Exactly.
Okay, so grief is looking backward at a loss. Solastalgia is looking at your immediate changed surroundings, but eco-anxiety is looking forward.
Right.
It's the future-oriented apprehension of what happens next.
It's deeply focused on the apprehension of what's coming, which is exactly why it generates so much restless energy in the body. But wait, if this is a completely rational, biologically appropriate response to a very real fire, does that mean the people who aren't anxious are the ones suffering from a delusion?
That's a fascinating way to look at it.
I mean, why are so many people walking around completely unbothered while the house fills with smoke?
Well, the human brain has an incredible capacity for cognitive dissonance and denial.
We're really good at ignoring things.
Very good. When faced with a threat that feels too massive to comprehend, a really common psychological defense mechanism is to just block it out entirely.
Just compartmentalize it.
Exactly. People compartmentalize the threat so they can get through their daily lives. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the data shows that those defense mechanisms are breaking down. A staggering portion of the globe is fully aware of the smoke.
Yeah, that international study of 32 countries really paints a picture of that breakdown.
It really does. They found that climate anxiety was prevalent in every single nation surveyed.
Every single one.
Every single one. Almost 50% of respondents globally reported they were very worried or extremely worried about climate change.
Almost half the globe. That's wild.
And when you narrow the focus to young people, the demographic realities become incredibly stark.
Because it's their future we're talking about.
Right. A massive survey of 10,000 young people, aged 16 to 24 across 10 different countries, found that 84% were at least moderately worried.
84%.
And 59% were very or extremely worried. In the U.S., a survey of nearly 16,000 youth found over a third reported that these feelings actively disrupted their ability to eat, sleep, concentrate, and maintain relationships.
So it's fundamentally altering the day-to-day neurological functioning of an entire generation.
Yeah. And there's a 2025 systematic review in Nature and Mental Health that explored the mathematics behind why kids and young adults are carrying this specific burden.
What did they find?
They found that a child born in 2020 faces 7 times the risk of extreme heat waves and twice the risk of wildfire exposure compared to someone born in 1960.
Oh my God. 7 times.
Yeah. So they aren't just processing an abstract scientific concept. They are anticipating a lifetime of heightened, compounded risk.
They're basically looking at the actuarial tables of their own lives and realizing the math is fundamentally different for them.
Precisely.
Does the psychological burden look the same everywhere, or is the geography of the anxiety as, uneven as the climate impacts themselves?
The intensity of the distress correlates very strongly with regional vulnerability.
Makes sense.
A cross-national study of 6 countries, India, Italy, the Philippines, Turkey, Trinidad and Tobago, and Hungary, found clear statistical differences.
Who is hit the hardest?
Looking globally, respondents in places like the Philippines, India, and Nigeria report a much stronger psychological impact than those in the United States and Finland.
That reflects the reality of the global South, right? The anxiety isn't about some event decades in the future. It's about the immediate collapse of local infrastructure, agriculture, and physical safety happening right now.
Exactly. The threat is at their front door. But even in nations less immediately devastated by complete infrastructure failure, the psychological toll is mounting.
Right.
Like a 2025 French study found that 87% of respondents were eco-anxious.
Wow. 87%. In France.
Yeah, and for 37% of them, it resulted in functional symptoms, meaning it actually disrupted their daily lives, and at least 4% actually required clinical psychological care to function.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the sources note a really consistent gender divide in how this dread is processed.
Oh, yes. The gender gap is very pronounced in the data.
Right, like female respondents consistently express greater levels of concern and negative emotions regarding climate change than male respondents, who tend to lean a bit more optimistic.
Yes.
Is this gap because the physical threat is inherently different for them, or is it a difference in how we're, socially conditioned to process and express existential threats?
Well, this raises a really important question about the intersection of socialization and systemic vulnerability. While the sources don't point to a single neurological difference, they highlight that vulnerable populations generally are at an elevated risk for severe eco-anxiety.
And women are often structurally more vulnerable.
Exactly. In many regions, women have less economic mobility, fewer resources to relocate after a disaster, and they bear heavier burdens regarding family care.
Right, taking care of kids or elderly parents when a storm hits.
Yeah. And this intersects with other demographics too. People with pre-existing mental health conditions, marginalized groups, migrants, and displaced persons bear a disproportionate psychological burden because they have the fewest resources to buffer against the impacts.
When you have billions of people, especially these vulnerable populations, carrying this much chronic dread, that is a massive amount of pent-up energy in the global nervous system.
It's an immense amount of energy.
Where does all that anxious energy go? Like, does it drive us to fix the problem, or does it just break us down?
Psychologists categorize the manifestation of this energy into two distinct pathways: adaptive anxiety and maladaptive anxiety.
Okay, so adaptive anxiety being the motivator, right? The energy being channeled into a productive physical output.
Spot on. In the 32-country study, climate anxiety was strongly associated with a higher frequency of positive, pro-environmental behaviors.
Like what kind of behaviors?
People experiencing this anxiety were more likely to restructure their lives. So, saving energy, altering their diets toward climate-friendly food choices, using sustainable transportation.
So they're taking control of their personal impact.
Yeah. And more importantly, in 12 of those 32 countries, this internal anxiety was directly linked to outward civic action, specifically increased participation in climate protests.
Wow. So the distress broke through the cognitive dissonance and actually pushed people into the streets.
Exactly. It's the functional smoke detector response.
The smoke detector wakes you up, so you grab a bucket of water and start coordinating with your neighbors.
Right.
But what happens when the alarm simply never turns off?
Well, that leads to the maladaptive side, where the energy turns inward and becomes paralytic.
Paralytic. That sounds awful.
It is. When the nervous system is stuck in a chronic state of fight or flight without a clear resolution, it exhausts the body's cortisol regulation.
It just burns you out.
Completely.
Yeah.
This manifests physically and psychologically as severe insomnia, chronic headaches, panic attacks, and really profound depressive helplessness.
Oh, man.
The statistics around acute exposure are genuinely alarming. Estimates suggest that 25 to 50% of people exposed to a sudden acute climate disaster will experience severe negative mental health outcomes like PTSD, suicidal ideation, or substance use disorders.
Let me just make sure I heard that right. Up to half of the people who survive a major extreme weather event walk away with a severe, debilitating mental health outcome.
Up to half, yes.
That is just, it's staggering.
And we're seeing the biochemical toll of chronic slow-moving changes as well. A meta-analysis in the source material found that a mere 1 degree Celsius increase in mean daily temperature is associated with a 1.7% increase in suicide deaths.
Wait. How does ambient temperature directly drive suicide rates? That seems crazy.
It sounds like a leap, but it's a combination of physiological exhaustion and neurochemical disruption.
Okay.
High sustained temperatures, especially during heat waves, prevent the core body temperature from dropping at night.
Right, when it's too hot to sleep.
Exactly. And that temperature drop is biologically required for restorative REM sleep. When populations are chronically sleep deprived, emotional regulation degrades rapidly.
Your brain just can't cope.
No, it can't. And simultaneously, heat stress actually alters serotonin and dopamine production, pushing already vulnerable nervous systems past their breaking point.
Oh, wow, so it's a literal chemical change.
Yes. A 2025 observational study is actually currently exploring this specific link between eco-anxiety and suicide risk in hospitalized adolescents.
So if adaptive anxiety gets us off the couch to change our habits and protest, but maladaptive anxiety physically exhausts our neurochemistry and leads to, like, hospitalization, are we trying to cure the anxiety completely? Or is there, I don't know, a Goldilocks zone of panic we're trying to maintain?
What's fascinating here is that the clinical consensus strongly advocates for maintaining exactly that Goldilocks zone.
Really? So we want to stay a little anxious.
The goal is absolutely not to eliminate eco-anxiety. Curing it entirely would require a very dangerous detachment from reality.
Take the battery out of the smoke detector?
Precisely. The therapeutic objective is to transform the anxiety from paralyzing rumination into purposeful, sustainable action.
Okay.
To achieve that, we have to look at the environmental drivers that push people out of the adaptive zone and into the maladaptive state.
Because if we want to avoid paralysis, we have to look at what's actively accelerating the dread.
Right.
And the research identifies 5 key drivers pushing people over the edge, right? The most immediate one being media exposure.
Yeah. The human brain simply isn't wired to process continuous, high-definition footage of global catastrophes.
We just aren't built for it.
No. Frequent exposure to media about climate impacts significantly amplifies the amygdala's threat response, which strengthens climate anxiety to a debilitating degree.
But there's a massive contradiction there, though.
How so?
Well, as citizens, we are constantly told it's our civic duty to stay informed. But the data suggests that consuming this information is exactly what is paralyzing us.
It's a catch-22.
Right. So how does anyone balance being an engaged citizen with protecting their own neurochemistry?
The boundary really lies in the intention behind the consumption.
Intention.
Yeah. Are you seeking specific information to guide a decision or action? Or are you just passively doom-scrolling, absorbing disaster narratives without any outlet for the resulting adrenaline?
Oh, that's a great distinction.
Because that passive consumption is often compounded by the second driver, perceived government inaction.
Yes. The feeling that the people at the wheel are either asleep or actively driving toward the cliff.
Exactly. Eco-anxiety is heavily negatively associated with a person's faith in their government's response.
Makes total sense.
When people consume media showing systemic failure, and they lose faith that their leaders are implementing solutions, their anxiety spikes. It's processed psychologically as a profound systemic betrayal.
You feel betrayed by the institutions meant to protect you, so you look to your friends and family, which I'm guessing triggers the third driver, social contagion.
You nailed it. We are deeply social creatures, and we constantly co-regulate our nervous systems with the people around us.
So panic spreads.
Climate anxiety is demonstrably higher when other people in your immediate surroundings express negative feelings about the future. If the people you trust are panicking, your biology tells you to panic too.
Which compounds with the final 2 drivers we touched on earlier, right? Age, driven by the developmental vulnerability and statistical risk of youth.
Yes.
And direct exposure, the trauma of actually living through a disaster.
Recognizing those 5 drivers, media, perceived inaction, social contagion, age, and direct exposure, is what allows us to build psychological defenses. We can't control all of them, but we can disrupt the feedback loops.
This is where we bridge the gap between understanding the science and actually utilizing the toolkit.
My favorite part.
The sources break the evidence-based solutions into 2 distinct tiers. Let's look at tier 1, individual coping mechanisms. These are the biological and psychological circuit breakers you can use to regulate your own nervous system.
The first circuit breaker is mindfulness and acceptance.
How does that work in this context?
A 2025 study highlighted the role of trait mindfulness. It's the psychological ability to observe your own thoughts without immediately judging them or reacting to them.
Okay.
It's about creating a buffer zone between the frightening stimulus, like a terrifying news report, and your internal biological response.
So you aren't fighting the terrifying thought or pretending it isn't real. You're just letting it sit in the passenger seat without letting it grab the steering wheel.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. And the second tool builds on that space, cognitive reframing.
Flipping the script.
Yeah, it's a positive psychology intervention that shifts the narrative from paralyzing helplessness to realistic hope.
What does that look like in practice?
Instead of an internal monologue saying, the biosphere is collapsing and I am entirely powerless, you deliberately reframe it to, the situation is incredibly severe, but I have agency to contribute to measurable solutions in my immediate community.
Which brings us to the tool that directly combats the doom scrolling. Media discernment, often called digital hygiene.
So crucial right now.
It's about establishing rigid boundaries around how and when you allow catastrophic information into your brain. You set specific times to read reputable sources, and you explicitly forbid the endless algorithmic scrolling that hijacks your threat response.
And when you step away from the algorithm, you open the door for the fourth tool, nature-based therapies.
Like actually going outside.
Yeah. A 2025 study evaluated a 2-day intensive forest therapy program, sometimes called forest bathing, for individuals affected by natural disasters.
Did it help?
Immeasurably. They documented significant reductions in depression, anxiety, and cortisol levels, alongside real improvements in mindfulness.
Because by physically placing yourself back into the environment you're terrified of losing, you're reminding your nervous system of the Earth's current resilience, rather than just fixating on its future destruction.
That's beautifully put. The final individual tool integrates all of these. Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
ACT? Got it.
This is a therapeutic framework specifically adapted for climate distress. It builds psychological flexibility, teaching individuals how to hold the heavy, difficult emotions of grief and fear while simultaneously committing to concrete actions that align with their core values.
I look at Tier 1, the mindfulness, the cognitive reframing, the media boundaries, and they function like a really well-made raincoat.
I like where this is going.
They're essential survival gear. They regulate your temperature, keep you functional, and stop you from freezing to death in the storm. But a raincoat doesn't stop the rain.
No, it doesn't.
Tier 2 is collective action. And collective action is actually building a shelter together with other people so you can all get out of the storm.
The clinical data completely supports that analogy.
Yeah.
Individual coping mechanisms are necessary to keep you functioning, but collective action is the actual cure for the paralysis.
The cure, that's a strong word.
It is. Moving from isolated individual worry to shared, collective engagement is the single most effective intervention for reducing climate anxiety.
But why does getting involved in a group work better than just managing your own internal psychology?
There is a landmark piece of research from the Sydney Environment Institute that investigated rural Australian communities exposed to massive droughts, catastrophic fires, and severe flooding.
Oh man, the front lines.
Absolutely on the front lines of climate trauma. The researchers found that collective action was seen as vastly more crucial in easing climate anxiety and restoring well-being than individual clinical therapy.
Because the trauma of climate change is inherently a collective trauma. Trying to treat it purely as an individual neurosis leaves the person feeling isolated with a problem that is just far too large for one nervous system to process.
That is exactly it. When people engage in community-led support, whether it's neighbors physically helping neighbors prepare for floods, inclusive local planning for disaster resilience, or organized political action, it fundamentally alters their brain chemistry.
It changes the chemistry.
The American Psychological Association noted that collective climate action actively reduces eco-anxiety because it moves the brain from a state of helpless isolation to a state of empowered hopefulness.
Wow.
It restores a sense of shared purpose and tangible agency, which produces dopamine and buffers against cortisol.
So it's biologically protective.
Very much so. A 2025 study on attention training even showed that simply shifting a person's focus toward climate change mitigation approaches, literally just looking at the people actively solving the problem, led to significantly lower levels of anxiety.
So what does this all mean? It means it's time to map out a practical path forward for your own life. If you're listening to this, here are the tangible steps you can take to move from paralysis to power. First, validate your feelings. If your heart is racing at 2 a.m., recognize that your alarm system is working perfectly. You are paying attention.
That validation is key.
Second, when the existential dread spikes, use a physical circuit breaker to ground yourself. Use box breathing right now if you need to. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. It forces the parasympathetic nervous system to calm your body down.
Third, practice aggressive media discernment. Put a hard timer on your news intake, 20 minutes a day to stay informed, and then you close the app. Protect your amygdala.
And finally, take one collective action this week, just one. Join a local environmental chapter, attend a town zoning meeting, volunteer at a community garden, or simply invite 3 neighbors over for coffee to talk about what you'd all do if the power grid failed. You have to reconnect the social fabric.
We often think of the climate crisis as an exclusively technological or geopolitical problem waiting for a massive top-down fix.
Right, like waiting for someone else to fix it.
We wait for a new carbon capture machine or a sweeping global treaty to save us. But looking closely at the psychological data, what if the most vital technology for our actual survival isn't a machine at all?
What do you mean?
What if it's simply our capacity to look up from our screens, knock on a neighbor's door, and build community resilience from the ground up?
That is a really powerful thought to leave on. You don't have to save the entire world tonight. You just have to connect with the piece of it that is right outside your door. So tonight, if you find yourself staring at that ceiling, take a deep breath. Remember that your anxiety is just a deeply human sign that you care. And know that your actions, especially the ones you take alongside others, absolutely matter.